So, good evening, everybody. My name is Antonia Wunderlich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, I would like to welcome you to this online event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the British-German Association is a charity that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to support public education about Germany in the UK, so we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our newsletter. Tonight, we have the great honour of welcoming best-selling author Thomas Harding and Chair of the Jewish Museum London, Nick Viner, to a discussion on Thomas's book, The House by the Lake, an astonishing true story of a wooden cottage on the shore of a lake on the outskirts of Berlin that witnessed much of Germany's 20th century history. The children's book was published in the UK in September with beautiful illustrations by Britta Teckentrup. So I have both books here, and I would say they make ideal Christmas gifts, and I would strongly recommend you read them. The House by the Lake is a breathtakingly vivid account of personal histories, the histories of 5 families, to be exact, against the backdrop of a turbulent century. And the story really sticks with you a long time, even after turning the last page. So please do support your local bookshops, or you can order the books off Amazon. I've added 2 links for both books in the chat already. And when COVID permits, I would also recommend visiting the Alexander House, of which both Thomas and Nick are board members. I'll also put the link to the Alexander House website in the chat, so you can explore the project online. So there we go, it's in the chat now. So before showing a brief 2-minute introductory clip that was aired on the BBC World Service following the release of Thomas's children's book, a quick note on the technology. There will be a Q&A session after the discussion, and the Q&A will be conducted via the chat. So you should be able to find the chat icon at the bottom of your screens. And if you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions. Please feel free to do so over the course of the event. So without further ado, I would now like to share the clip that was aired on the BBC World Service before handing over to Thomas and Nick.
A long time ago, there was a little wooden house by a lake. The house was built by a kind doctor and his cheery wife, who wanted to live with their 4 children away from the busy city. So I wrote The House by the Lake because it's got this remarkable history. When my family was there, it was during the Nazi period. Then the next family who moved in was there during the Second World War. And in the 1960s, the Berlin Wall was built between the back of the house and the lake, right through the garden.
For 40 years, these people have lived with a lake really close, and all they could see was a wall.
When I was growing up, my grandmother, Elsie, she was this larger-than-life character. She would always talk about this little house that she had to leave in Berlin. And then when she was in her 80s, she took me and my cousins back to see the place where she grew up. Actually, she sat down on the plane and she said, you know, you need to look at these documents. And this is my grandfather Eric's passport. You can see here the Nazi swastika symbol. And this is the passport he had when he came to England. This is my great-grandfather Alfred, this Jewish doctor. He was in the First World War, and he was given this. He's one of the very few Jewish people, soldiers, who were given an Iron Cross first class. So when the Nazis came to power, he couldn't imagine things getting as bad as they became because he was German. And this is the neighbour telling my great-grandfather to get out of the country. The young man came down the sandy path. He took out a key, opened the door, and saw at once that the house needed help. So I went back to Germany in 2013, and I found the house in terrible shape. The windows were broken, and the walls had graffiti. And over the last 6-7 years, I've been working with the local community and members of my own family to first clean up the house, save it from destruction. It's now protected as a monument. And the house is now a place of education, a place of reconciliation, where members of the public, school kids can visit. And it's a chance for them to look at the history, learn lessons of the past, so that hopefully we don't make the same mistakes again. Finally, the house shone like new. It was a witness to some of the most horrible things of the 20th century. but it was also a place of pleasure and dance and storytelling and friendship and family. And I would love that it could continue inspiring people to appreciate those things in their lives.
So, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. And Thomas, good evening to you. What a great way to start this conversation with a film that gives a real flavour of what the lake house was like when it was first lived in and enjoyed by the Alexander family, and then, of course, its journey into decline and back. And to talk more about this and the beautiful children's book it spawned, I'm really pleased to be here in conversation with my good friend Thomas. We actually got to know each other well, working closely on what became the Alexander House project in Groß-Glienicke, and we'll certainly talk about that a little bit later. But over that time, I've come to appreciate some particular qualities of Thomas: his energy, his drive, his tenacity, his absolute refusal to take no for an answer, and his storytelling abilities. And all of these have gone into making him into an excellent detective of the past and an inspiring writer in the present. So Thomas, these qualities come through particularly in the books you've written about your family. Most recently, Legacy, the story of your mother's side of the family, the Salmons and the Glucksteins and the creation of the amazing Lions empire, but that's for another day. And before that, Hans and Rudolph, and of course, The House by the Lake, which was drawing on your father's side of the family, the Alexanders. But this is your first foray into writing a book for children. And certainly I found the story is told in a really engaging and sensitive way. And Britta's illustrations are really special. And I think to start with, maybe for you as a serious journalist and writer of well-researched books for adults, why a children's book?
Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks for that really kind introduction. And Antonia, it's really great that you invited us here tonight. I've been looking forward to this all day. So why a children's book? I love children's books. You know, when I was a kid, I loved reading them. Later, when I was a teenager, I spent a bit of time in the Muswell Hill Children's Bookshop. I don't know if you know that bookshop. When I had my own kids, at the end of the day, I love reading picture books to them. I've actually kept many of these picture books. I still have on my shelf here in my office. And, it's always been a dream to write a picture book. And there's something about them, I think, which it does a different type of work than an adult book of nonfiction. For me, maybe a bit like graphic novels, there's something about illustrations going with the text. It kind of, for me, it works on a different level. When you and I worked on the Alexander House and we worked to renovate, it took 2 or 3 years. And it was about a year ago that we opened it up, if you remember. And there was a moment that I was really struck home for me, and I was watching all these people turn up for open day, and it was the first time we'd opened it to the public. It was this really exciting moment, and there was like 300 or 400 people there, I think, but a lot of them were kids. And I remember watching some of these kids go up to the walls of the house. It's a tiny house. Don't think of it as a big palace or a villa. It's only, my uncle calls it a bicycle shed. It's about 9 meters by 10 meters. And on one of the external walls, there's a bullet hole, which was caused by a bullet at the end of the Second World War when the Russians came to the village and they were fighting the Germans. And I watched the kids go up to this hole and touch it and feel it. And then later I saw them inside looking at the wallpaper with the sunflowers. And then in the garden, there was a little bit of metal and a bit of concrete, which were actually the remains of the Berlin Wall, which was built through the garden. And I remember them watching them touching this thing. And I was thinking, wow, they're really relating to this story, the physicality of it. And I was thinking, I wonder if there's a way of making this story. I mean, The House by the Lake, the adult book, is 120,000 words. Is there a way of translating this for a younger audience? Some of the themes are really dark. You've got the Berlin Wall, you've got the bombs dropped on Berlin, you've obviously got the Nazi period, you've got the Stasi period, I was wondering if I could do this, and I was really hopeful. Then I happened to meet a very well-known children's writer called Nicola Davis, and I was at this literary festival in Scotland, and I said to her, it's always been my dream to write a children's book, and here I have this idea, but I'm not sure I can do it because of these difficulties, and also I'm not sure I can do it. I don't know how to do a children's book. And she said, just have a go. And so I went, when I got home, I had a go. I was writing at my computer, and I had a few drafts, and I sent it off to Walker Books, and to my amazing happiness and surprise and delight, they said, yeah, we'd be excited to do this. And then they're the ones who then had this genius idea of working with Britta Teckentrup, this very well-known children's illustrator who happens to live in Berlin, and then put us together. And it was a fantastic relationship.
And most of the children who come to the house, and particularly with the education program that's been going on, tend to be older children, tend to be teenagers. But obviously you pitched it at a much lower level. Is that because of the illustration, or is there some other motivation, or for how you pitched it?
No, so I really wanted to be able to find a way of telling this story for a younger audience. And when I started working on the book, I was thinking about these darker themes, these more difficult themes, because the book is also a joyful book. It's about loving this house. It's about eating ice cream on the terrace, about swimming in the lake. It's about having parties. It's about being with the family. So there's both the good and the bad. And when I was thinking about how to tell it for a younger audience, it suddenly struck me that if you peel away the facts, the historical facts, by focusing on the emotional arc of the characters and of the house itself, the house as a character in the book, you then actually come across ideas and situations that young kids would understand. It's about falling in love with a place and having it taken from you. It's about people being mean to you. It's about bullies. It's about the joy of being with family, you know. And so those are the things I focused on. And actually that was incredibly liberating, because by focusing on the emotional journeys of the characters, it became really exciting and became more universal. And, you know, another thing, for example, is, you know, what is the difference between a house and a home? You know, a house is a building, a structure. Some people, it could be a big building, it could be a flat, it could be a tent, you know. But a home is something different. It's a place of memory. It's a place of emotion, of togetherness, and a place you leave, but you come back to. And children experience that, you know, whatever the size of the place they live. And we know this, of course, during COVID. You know, we're all very familiar with the places we live now. And so I really wanted something people could relate to. And, you know, my grandmother called this house her soul place. You know, it was very special to her. And I was hoping that when people read this book, especially younger people, that they might start thinking about what is their special place. It might be a spot by a river. It might be a place they go with their family. It might be a place, I don't know, somewhere they visit on holiday. So, you know, I was hoping for universal ideas, universal touchstones.
And as a writer, you said, you know, the main book is 120,000 words, and whilst I hate to call you prolix, this is about 1,000 words, and that, the process of distilling that down, how difficult was that, and how, I guess, interesting was that?
Well, I think once I gave myself permission to take the facts out and focus on the emotion, it actually became remarkably easy. And I was thinking, what would I like to hear as a child, or what would my children like to hear? And I actually tried it out on a few kids as well. And there is some information at the back, so I thought it was important to have the historical truth is in the book. It's in the back. There's some notes about the various characters, about the history. So I thought it was important to lock it and anchor it in that. But the actual book itself, I'm hoping kids, as you know, young kids, 7, 8, could read it. And so far, I had a great session with primary school kids recently, and they were intelligent, and they were asking all these interesting questions, and they were curious. They wanted to know about why these people left, and they want to understand about the house and how the house felt. And, you know, that's so exciting to me to have those kind of conversations.
And of course, by having it for younger children, it does give you permission to illustrate it, and I think we should talk for a moment about the illustration, because I think this ability that they capture the sort of the lightness and the darkness, the happy times and the sinister time. I think, Antonia, we've got some slides. We can have a look at some images.
Yeah, there we go.
Maybe talk about them. We'll just have a look as you flick through
Yeah,
them.
That first image was of my family, the Alexander family. Thanks, Antonia. And the girl with the long braids is my grandmother, Elsie. And then you've got Alfred. He was this really well-known doctor in Berlin. His clients included Albert Einstein, Marlene Dietrich, his wife Henny, and then the twins at the front, who are always getting themselves in trouble, Hans and Paul. And the Hans, the little boy at the front there, is the same Hans who features in Hans and Rudolph. So he grew up to be this Nazi hunter for the British Army and tracked down the commandant of Auschwitz. And this was their weekend house. And so this picture is the next family. Well, first of all, our family is kicked out by the Nazis, and then the property is seized by the Gestapo, by the Nazis, and then another family moves in, this music publishing house from Berlin. And they then fall in love with the property. And then during the Second World War, I think this is a remarkable picture by Britta. You know, this is if you imagine, if you've been to Berlin, but the house is just to the west of West Berlin. So the planes coming in over from England would come very low over the house on their way to Berlin, which is what this picture is portraying. And when I interviewed people in the village, they said that the sky was illuminated pink and orange and red from the bombs, and they could see the sky, that it was close enough to Berlin that they could actually see that from where they were in the village. Would have been terrifying. And this is another happy time after the Second World War. A third family moves in, and this is them having a great time on the lake. And then if you see the top right-hand corner, this is ice sailing. I never knew about this, but you could actually put these ice skates on the boat, and you can go around the lake. And then there, on the bottom, you see the sunflower wallpaper. And Britta used the historical images and the pictures to produce as closely as she could the pictures. This is now us in the 2000s. I went back to the house and it was in terrible shape in 2013. And then together with the local residents and my family, we got together and we set about cleaning up the house because it was in terrible shape. It was effectively abandoned, broken windows, graffiti on the walls. And we first of all took all the garbage out and started repairing it. And then the next picture you'll see is actually the house as it was when it was first built. This is a picture by Lotte Jacobi, who's a very famous female photographer in Berlin in the 1920s. And there's my great-great-grandfather. I don't know if you can see him on the back porch, Lucien Picard. And he would be overlooking, his view would be of the lake, Großklinischer See, which is this lovely freshwater. And this is now.
We're very proud of this now. Yeah.
We're very proud of that picture. Just so gorgeous. And this is, and people say, are those the original colors? And the answer is yes. We actually hired quite a lot of expense. We hired a picture historian. What was that? What is it? An expert in historical paints. And they went around kind of cutting back peeling back the paint and finding out what the original colors were. And then we had to mix them. And those are the original colors. It's just totally beautiful.
So Thomas, talking about the illustrations and working with an illustrator, which obviously is very different from just putting in some photographs into it. How did that work? And how did you get to something that you liked? I mean, it's certainly quite a nerve-wracking process in the first instance.
It was very much a tango. So I mean, I wrote the text and then I met with her and we just hit it off immediately. And she had a real sensitivity to the subject. She's incredibly busy, but she said that there was something about the story that spoke to her. So she put everything else aside. And then we had coffee in Berlin and we went out the house together. And so I had a chance to introduce, and this is before the house was finished. So she had to imagine what the house was going to look like in the final illustrations. And then she just went off. And you know, I wrote my thing quite quickly and she took months. I mean, her method is just to go to create an enormous quantity of material. And from that, she put together what I think are extraordinary images. They've captured both the tone, but as you said, the color and the emotion. And I think they're very attractive and also quite fun. And there's various animals you can kind of track for younger readers throughout the story. And then when I first saw them, because I was sent them by Walker Books, I was like, wow, you know, it's just totally amazing. I had very little input. I had a couple of things I suggested, like the uniform of one of the soldiers didn't look quite right to me, and a couple of other things. But for the most part, this was totally her thing. And I
I don't know what you think, but I just think they work really
Yeah,
well
it's
together.
very special and captures the mood. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know how many people who are on this call have actually read yet the House by the Lake, but it might be good to just touch on the main
Sure.
elements of the story, and actually particularly the subtitles, A Story of Germany, and I think in a way that's one of the interesting elements, is that it has that quality. Can you also talk about why you think it sort of merits that subtitle?
Yeah, so when I started the book, it started as a project, an inquiry into my family. What happened to this house? Why was it abandoned? Why was it, why was my grandmother so attached to it? And then when I went to the village and I started talking to people, I realized that they were also very attached. I met this gentleman who lived just behind the house, and I explained to them our family trauma, 1930s, had to leave Germany. We lost some family members in the Holocaust. And he was very sympathetic, but then he went on to say actually that his family trauma was 1945, when the Russians arrived and they got kicked out. His mother was taken away. She was brutally assaulted. And I was like, that's really interesting. Same geography, same place, two traumas happening on top of each other. And the more I spoke to people, the more I was able to speak to the former residents, because I spoke to all the occupants. There was 5 families. I realized that this house had this extraordinary front seat on history of 100 years of German history, starting with the Kaiserreich, the time when the Kaiser was in power, and then during the National Socialist period, during the Second World War, when the Russians arrived, the splitting of Germany, and then of course the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was built, as I said before, between the back of the house and the lake, so through the garden, and then the wall being taken down and reunification, and then our family coming back and working with the residents. So it has this opportunity to look at the history of Germany, but also through this microcosm of this house. It's a very modest place, but also see how the environment was impacted by history. I mean, for me, history is very personal, so it happens to us, but also we influence how history evolves. And looking at how I went out there, I spent some time with some biologists and botanists, and they were explaining how certain trees came and went, and how when the war was there, it destroyed all the environment, and now how it's coming back. And that just tracking or tracing history's imprint through the local habitat, I thought was really interesting. And I think there's something very special about the village, because it's right on the edge of what was West Berlin and East Germany, so it's right on the cusp. I mean, the Brandenburg border goes through the middle of the lake, just a few meters from the back of the house. So I think that's really interesting as well.
And in terms of the sort of the process of researching this, I mean, how did you go about it? I happen to know your German's not amazing, so obviously that was
fantastic.
That was a challenge, but also presumably there's some quite surprising and also really quite exciting findings.
Yes, I mean, I met one person, and then she introduced me to another, and then we just had cafe and cooking. We just went door to door. We'd be invited in. People would share their stories. They'd share their photographs, and it seemed like an untapped resource. It wasn't that hard persuading people to talk with me, and maybe because I was in this strange role of being an outsider and an insider. I couldn't speak German, but I was German. I was from there, but I didn't live there. And somehow maybe that made it safer to talk to me. And some people shared their stories, which normally they would not share. And as you know, in Germany, as I understand it, ideas of privacy and intimacy and publicly sharing is very different from Britain or the States. But somehow people trusted me with their stories. And then in the archives, again, maybe because I couldn't speak German, it actually enabled me to go through vast amounts of material with researchers, because I knew what I was looking for. I didn't know the facts. The facts were whatever was in the documents, but I knew what kind of things I was looking for. And then when I was interviewing people, I was very interested in the kind of the objects, the history of the objects. So, for example, I would go and say to people, what in the 1970s, what did you drink tea and coffee out of? And my researcher I was with, who was a very young lady, was like, no, you can't ask that, it's too intimate. It's too, and I said, no, just let's ask. And she said, well, they won't know, they won't remember. I said, well, they probably will. They used the same coffee pot for 10 years. And it turns out, of course, they did remember. They had a lovely sunflower on it. And So I'm very interested. I write narrative nonfiction, so I'm very interested in the details. I'm interested in the colors and the smells and the sounds. I'm interested to know the weather. I want to know. I'm fascinated by the fact that the same room where my grandmother slept was the place that the Furmans had their party before they were married, and they smashed plates outside, and when they did, they alerted the guards by the wall who were just a few meters away. And it was the same wall, the same room where Bernd Kuhner lived, and where he had his birthday, but nobody could come because they were in the security zone, and only kids in the security zone could meet each other. And later on, that's from where he then tried to jump over the wall and get over to Westborough. So it's really interesting how a space can have different memories and different experiences, even though it's the same kind of building, same kind of, and traces, and the traces of each family gets inherited.
Yeah, I was going to say, I guess objects as well become relevant. Thinking about the Meisel's record player, maybe interesting to talk about that and the music.
Yes, so one of the most extraordinary experiences has been this family called the Meisels. They were the family who were the Nazi family, and he's not a top level war criminal kind of person, but he has this very ambiguous personality. He's going to be thriving in any kind of situation, and he took advantage of the situation, and he took advantage of what's called Aryanization. So when the Gestapo seized the house, he then was able to purchase it at a low price, and it was then his Wochenend house, his weekend house, and that's where my grandmother was. That was his music area. That's where he kind of composed music. And during the Second World War, that became their refuge. Another interesting thing about this house is that my family left as refugees. Other people used the house as a refuge. I think that's quite interesting. And but the Meisels are really funny, or interesting. So a couple of years ago, I met with Doris Meisel. You met Doris Meisel. She's this very small but feisty woman, probably in her 80s now. She had silver pants. She's a real rock and roller. So after the Second World War, the Meisel music company became really big, and it had hits with David Bowie, the Berlin Trilogy, and Boney M, and all those kind of people. And so they did really well. And I took her out to the house, and she had this plastic bag, and she said, "I want you to have this plastic bag." I said, "Okay, what's in the bag?" She said, "This bag is very important to me, and I want you to have it." And I said, "Okay." She said, "But I want you to know that my family was against me seeing you. They didn't want me to be here today. But in the 1960s, I swore that I would always tell the truth. And it was very important to me because my generation," she said, "we asked our parents about what they did during the war, and our grandparents. It was always very important to me that I told the truth. So I want you to have this plastic bag." And I said, okay. She's still gripping this bag. What's in the bag? She said, "This is inside this bag are the documents that prove that our family stole the house from your family. And I want you to tell the story, the good and the bad parts of the story." And I was really struck by that, and it was incredibly powerful. And as you know, she was actually there during open day in the room we call it the Meisel room, which is where Will Meisel used to play his piano. And she was there welcoming people and showing people around, and that so that has been an extraordinary experience, spending time with the various families, getting to know the stories of the house.
And were the people who were more reticent or more resistant to your telling the
There certainly
story?
were. Yeah, there were. So the Furmans, who live actually the closest, they live just around the corner, and they were there just after the Second World War, and this is the first time they've been back in 20 years, even though they lived around the corner. And they were very upset when they saw the house. This was before it was been renovated, but then they kind of retreated into their shell. They wanted nothing to do with it. Yeah, so people had different. I think people had different responses.
Tonight, clearly,
I guess I should say. Sorry, the other person I should say is Marcel. He was Marcel Adams. He was the last person to live in the house, just as an alternative to Furmans. He was there when they were basically having parties there and playing video games and having girls over and smoking weed on the roof and things. But he has actually he's been working to help restore the house. So the other day, he was there was an outbuilding, and he was putting a roof on the building because he really supports the project. So there's different reactions.
So we're here today under the auspices of the British-German Association, and maybe be good to talk a little bit about Germany and UK relations, as it's sort of seen through the lens of the book and the project, and maybe some of your thoughts, and maybe first off, in terms of both this children's book and the adult book. What's the reaction been in Germany to
So the book
publication?
came out in April, and in Germany first, and then it came out in the States and England in, I think it was, or Britain in September, and it's been published elsewhere. But the German response has been really very, very positive. I've spoken to various bookshops. Obviously, with COVID, things became complicated, but people have responded really well. And picture book publishing is different from adult publishing. You know, you're not as reliant, as I understand it, on the media. It's more about networks of libraries and schools and bloggers and word of mouth. And as I'm told, you know, I'm working with this wonderful small publishing company in Germany, Jacobi and Stewart, and they've been terrific to work with. In terms of the adult book, that was published, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, and you know, it's done great, as far as I understand it. But much more importantly than that is, and you've seen this, you know, whenever I'm at the house, inevitably someone will turn up unannounced at the front gate with the book in hand from either around Germany or somewhere around the world, saying, we had to come and see the house. And that's really cool. I mean, that's just amazing to imagine that the story has reached out. And when they come to see the house, I'm always nervous. I always tell people, it's not very big. Don't get your expectations up. and of course, you know, they fall in love with it, you know, for the most part. And there's something special about there's something special about the place. And somehow it survived all this crazy chaos and this turbulent history. Yeah. So, but you asked about the German-British part of it, and that's incredible. That's at the heart of this whole story, which is there was this moment, which I talk about in the book, where right at the very beginning, and our first ever, we called them cleanup days, where my family worked together with the local residents, and there was a lot of tension in my family. There's a lot of resistance, and I totally understood, and I'm totally sympathetic with it. There was real trauma and pain in our family. We lost family members who were murdered. Our property was taken from us. Our families kicked out of schools. We had to leave the country. Similar things happened to our friends. There's a lot of anger and trauma. And so when I went to them, I said, look, I've got this idea of working on this house, you know, in Berlin. They're like, are you crazy? What are you doing? You know, and people said maybe I was being disloyal to my grandparents and other family members. And it got really tricky. We worked through that, and after a while, some members of the family agreed to go over to clean up the house, and we had this incredible open day where we got together with, I think, 60 or 70 locals, and there was 14 of us, and we cleaned up the house. And at the end of the day, we had this village hall experience, and the mayor introduced everything, and then it was my turn to talk about the history and the story. And I put a picture up of my grandmother. She was wearing tennis whites because there was a tennis court by the house. They were terrible at tennis, and ridiculously, they put the tennis court next to the lake, and so they were always knocking the balls into the lake. It was absurd. But she had this, you know, white shoes, white trousers, white shirt, and I said, you know, this is my grandmother. And somebody said, so who is that again? And I was trying to explain, and as you said, my German, I can't speak German, so somebody said, who is that? And my father stood up and he said, that's my mother, Elsie, but he said it in German. And then there was total silence in the room. And it was like one of those, you know, these moments. It was like a big moment. And then he said, I'm very sorry, my German's not very good. And then he spoke for the next 6 or 7 minutes in perfect German about the family and about the history, why he was so pleased to be there, how he'd been anxious about coming and he wasn't so sure, but the day had been remarkable. He'd met some amazing people. He now understood that this project was about coming together, an opportunity at reconciliation. He was deeply, deeply moved by this whole experience. And there was something which changed in that moment. And I can feel it right now when I'm saying it. Before that, there was us, kind of the British German Jews, and then the local Germans. And that shifted. We became together, a community. And that was definitely a coming together of the British and the German. And that's been very much part of the process. And it's been quite a thing that as we've been running this project, there's been Brexit. I mean, that's been has been a parallel process, and it's been really painful. And listening to our friends in Germany and working with British diplomats in Berlin and German diplomats in London who've been incredibly supportive, all of them. And it's been quite a thing having that, and so much so that on the day that they announced that the Brexit result, that day I got a phone call from my friend in Germany saying that the federal government had just given a large amount of money to the project to help restore the building. So the very time that Britain's leaning away from Europe, Germany was leaning towards its kind of history and towards its reconciliation. So yeah, it's been quite a process.
And it's interesting, so this idea of education and reconciliation, which is what we sort of built the Alexander House project around.
Yeah.
In a way, it's really interesting how the house is playing a role in at least 3 different dimensions. I mean, there's the sort of the East-West, and it'd be interesting maybe to talk about a bit more about, you know, Groß-Glienicke as a small village right on the border of what was East and West Germany. There's obviously the Jewish and non-Jewish dimension. And of course, you know, with the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, and it's also, you know, something that we're familiar with here in the UK as well. And then the other piece about sort of locals and refugees, and with the influx of refugees, particularly Muslim refugees, into Germany, and the work that we've done with the refugees and the local village, but also the challenges. Can you just talk about some of those? That's a lot of things, but some of those dimensions.
As you said, so we've talked about the kind of this tension between the returning German Jews and the local Germans. As you said, there is definitely an East-West tension, and anyone who's been in this part of Brandenburg will know that. And with the rise of the FP and the in Brandenburg, and they've done really well recently, and that you can feel it. And there's definitely a sense, which is obvious, of those who kind of grew up in East Germany and those who grew up in West Germany. It's still very, very clear. And the tension comes in all forms, whether it's fights over spending on football versus some other kind of project or cultural project. And we've been, you know, we're in the middle of that. And then, as you say, this other tension, which is we were there during this extraordinarily brave and forward-thinking decision to allow over 1 million refugees to come to Germany, of which extraordinary for me personally were some of my family members. So my sister married a Syrian Kurd, and 4 of his nephews and nieces were part of that 1 million who came to Germany. And we were watching real time as they were arriving in Germany, as they were having to deal with the administration and learning the language, trying to find housing, trying to find jobs, dealing with the transition. And it was all so familiar, you know, with us being refugees earlier in the 1930s. And it suddenly became totally obvious to me that these are human experiences. This isn't about being Syrian or German or British or Jewish. These are just human experiences. It's about being forced to leave your home and homeland, having to make a new life in a new place. And I remember having this conversation with my relative, my sister and brother-in-law's nephew, and I asked him, what, because he was involved with one of these kind of cleanup days. And I said, why are you here? Don't you have other things you've got to be doing, like building up your life? He said, no, look, he said, I hope that sometime soon I'll be able to go back to my life and back to my country, and we'll be rebuilding our family house. And I found that incredibly moving. So yeah, that's been very much part of our story, but also part of our work. So some of the programming we've been doing is supporting efforts with the local refugee shelter in Groß-Glienicke, in Potsdam, in Berlin, doing what we call these dialogue sessions, where we bring people together from different communities and create a safe space where they can share their stories, and try and use some of the lessons of the Alexander House to build a better future.
Obviously, a central focus of the project has been the restoration of the house itself, and we saw the last image. There's some images in the film as well. This is a house that's been through so many different lives, but talk a bit about how we got to the particular version of the house that sort of now exists. I guess, you know, the year or the period, and how you sort of guided the navigation of all those different restoration choices.
Well, Nick, I have to say, I have to shout out for you, because you were very much part of that, you know, because
I fear I know some of the answers to this, but other people might not.
But I should explain to people that Nick was on the building committee, and he was very much at the heart of the restoration work, and used his considerable skills and resources and wisdom to deliver what's been this just extraordinary building. And there were some choices, weren't there? There was like, when do we restore it back to? 1927, 1936, when they had to leave? Do we do it after the war? Do we take down the parts of the building which weren't original because there have been some extensions? One of the questions was, can we replace parts of the fabric of the building, which would be so much cheaper as opposed to having to restore them? And according to the conservationists in the city of Potsdam and Brandenburg, we absolutely had to restore and conserve, which was probably 3 or 4 times more expensive. And I was quite resistant because I wanted a beautiful ceiling, I wanted lovely windows, and they're like, no, 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 no. They said, we're telling a story here. That's what we're doing. So you want to have the holes in the wall where the bullets are. You want to see where the sink used to hang. You want to see the streaks on the floor where they were marked by various objects. And actually, once I explained that, I totally agreed. But it took much more effort and fundraising, which is never easy. But we succeeded. And I mean, the house is just, it's just absolutely stunning. And, my family were never known for their kind of aesthetic taste. So my guess is they must have had some expert help, because the colors are beautiful, mustard yellows and these kind of dark kind of ivy greens and ox blood reds. I mean, they're beautiful, just stunning colors.
Very, very special. Very special. And when people come, what is it that they're typically looking for? What excites them most, or what intrigues them the most?
Yeah. So I've been there when people are there, and I think people come for different reasons. I think some people, they read the books and they just want to see it and have an experience. Other people want to just hear more of the history, and that we have guided tours every weekend, and there's a small exhibit with various objects from each family. We have different rooms for each families. I think some people want to introduce the story and the space to their friends and family. So I think there's different motivations. And then we have these, we have events there. Remarkably, given COVID, we've been open again since April. So it was only shut for about 2 or 3 months, I think. And because German has different rules and they've dealt with this differently. So we've, obviously we have had to have social distancing and using hygiene, and we've had to limit numbers, but we've been open for most of the year, and that's been great. I'm been pleased, and I'm very thankful for the volunteers, because the guides are all volunteers. They're locals who kind of love the story. They've learned about the history, and they want to share it with visitors. So
we're going to open in a moment for questions from the audience. So just one final question from me at this point. You call your most recent book Legacy, but it seems to me that the concept of legacy is even more manifest in The House by the Lake, and what The House by the Lake has led to. And so I suppose my question is, how important is the notion of legacy to you? And is this in fact your legacy, or could this become your legacy? What do you think?
So I think history is a process, right? It's constantly changing. One thing that we know about this story is that the structure and fabric of the house is affected by history. It was very close to being knocked down. When I arrived in 2013, the local council was going to knock the thing down. It could happen again. Everything is very precarious. Life is, and so are objects, human-made objects, and the environment. And I think that's something that we learn from the story. And without being too heavy, I think that one of the lessons is we have to fight to save what we love and to pass it down to the next generations. And I do hope that that's something that we've done together, along with yourself and my family members and the local residents. We've protected this soul space for future generations. And I hope that they feel the same way and they also protect it.
Great, thank you very much, Thomas. Antonia, do you want to
Yes, thank you so much. I am going to kickstart the Q&A with a question of my own, actually.
Oh.
So I was quite interested in this notion of the house as a place of refuge and as a haven, but also, of course, the theme of displacement plays a really important role in the book. And you also mentioned this could be for the house itself, because the house itself, as you said, is a really strong character. So I just wanted to ask how you related to both of these themes, and so displacement and refuge, and how it impacted your writing process and your research.
Tell me that last bit again. How
it impacted your writing process and research.
Yeah, so I mean, home and refuge and refugees is part of my family story. I mean, it's very much part of my grandmother's story, you know, when I was growing up, and she would very much share with us their story of having to leave, of having to build a new life. And when I saw her response to the building, I was really struck by the fact that this was the last physical trace of her life in Germany, because her family apartment had been blown up in the war. The clinic had also been destroyed, her father's clinic. And I think that's one of the reasons it was so important to her. It was a sense of made it real. And she wanted to share that with her. She took me and my cousins just after the wall came down. She took us to see the house. And she was deeply moved. And actually, I filmed it. So if anyone wants to see it, it's on their website. And you can actually see how house proud she is. And I'm told by my German friends that her Berliner accent is very clear, and she's quite bossy, telling this kind of tenant what to do and where to sit and how to come. But he equally is very house proud, talking about what he's done for the house, how he's improved it. So the idea of refugees has always been part of my story, and the idea of refuge, of a haven, became really clear to me when I started talking to the Meisel family. And I learned that that's actually what it was for them. And then the family, their creative director, the Hartmans, actually, this is another family, after the Meisels fled during the war, their creative director of Meisel Music then took over the house. And they literally hid in the basement, you know, during the fighting. And I think that's really interesting, how this house can become both, you know, a place of safety, but also a place of fear. And I think, isn't that true of all places? In terms of how it affected my writing, I think what I try to do in the book is try to inhabit different points of views and try and tell the story from different perspectives, realizing that this physical location, this building, this structure could have different emotional experiences, provide different emotional experiences for different people. It became obvious that I had to present those in different ways. And so the book is structured, both the children's book, but also the adult book, from the point of view of these different families. And one of the things that I wanted to do is to show how the building itself changed over time. And at the beginning of each of the parts, which starts each of the new family stories, we actually asked an architect to design the building, do an actual illustration of what the building looked, so you can see how the building shifts over time. And the idea was very much to show how the structure itself, the walls, the windows, the floors, was being impacted and showed traces of the history that was happening around it.
Thank you. I have so many questions coming in the chat, but there's just one more that I also want to ask, and that relates to childhood versus adulthood in the house, and how you would like your children, you mentioned at the beginning of the call that you had children, how you would like them to relate to the house going forward. Well,
my daughter has been very much part of the process of renovation, and we spent one afternoon where we're digging up the old Berlin Wall. She spent a year out in Berlin. She's definitely affected by it. And my cousins, various children as well, they're all very much part of it. And so I you know, my aunt said something too. She's been very involved in this project, Angela, and she's done a lot of work professionally with children. And she's always said that the children should be very much at the center of our work. So we've been working with schools, high schools in Berlin and in Potsdam and around Groß-Glienicke. And we've been doing a training program with them where they become ambassadors, and then they can take the story elsewhere. So children are very much part of
and
our,
from
our
the
vision.
UK as well, actually, schools in the UK who've come to visit, and again playing that role. So lots of exchange of school children and schools.
Yeah, and we welcome visits by children, by schools. You know, it's very much part of our vision for the future.
Okay, so I'm going to look at the chat right now, and the first question is from Vivian Brown, and she's saying that she visited last year before it opened, after reading about it in the Times, and she was asking if there was an architect and who was responsible for the decorative motif of the colonnade.
So this is one of the unknowns. There's two answers to that. The easy answer is that the house was based on a model house. There was an exhibition in the 1920s, and my great-grandfather and the guy next door, who's also a doctor, went to an exhibition in Berlin, and they said, you know, this is the house we want, and they hired a builder to build both those houses, and they actually shared some of the same motifs, this diamond motif. And I've looked through the planning files, because they still have those for both houses in the city of Potsdam, and they were very, very similar. Unfortunately, that neighbor's house got destroyed in a fire in the 70s. According to them, they believe that Paul Baumgarten had some influence, not on the design of this particular house, but on the model. And he was one of the most famous architects at the time. Architects in general are overexcited about this project. So two of the largest architectural magazines in Germany have featured it. They're very excited about it for a number of reasons. One is the process, the story of kind of renovating it, restoring it, but also the structure itself. It was one of the first, if not the first, weekend house, Wochenend houses, which have now become so popular outside Berlin. It's, you know, it's very symptomatic of that wooden Datsche, that kind of wooden house out in the countryside. And so when I first started this, I didn't believe anyone would be that interested, because, you know, it's this small little wooden house, but actually architecturally, I'm told it's actually a very important house.
And it's probably worth mentioning, Thomas, just for general information, we have a plan, should we manage to make it come to fruition and raise the funding, to build a seminar building behind the house. So at the back end of the land, it's a long strip of land, which will be a place, a residential space for people to come and do sort of retreats and so on. And we delighted that we've been working with David Chipperfield, who is obviously a well-known architect here, and particularly in Germany, because he and his office became very excited about the project. And we have a fantastic Chipperfield design, which is so far unbuilt, but maybe in the future. So there is, I think, a lot of interest going forward as well from an architectural perspective.
And again, the reason why we're doing that is so that we can host visits by schools. So maybe there'll be a class of 25 or 30, and they could stay overnight, and they could be part of some kind of ongoing workshop situation.
Wow, that's very, very exciting. I have another question by Mark Cotton, saying the book is such an important piece of work, and wondering, saying that your family initially were not interested in the investigation, and how did it feel when they came around to the idea?
Yes, I mean, to be totally honest, I mean, it was a really hard period, because there was some real, and as I said earlier, legitimate anxiety and resistance. And it wasn't overnight. It took, and Nick was present for some of this, you know, it wasn't, there was no magic wand. It took a lot of work and trust, and actually people coming over to Germany and getting to know each other. And even after a year or two, when things seemed to be kind of over kind of some obstacle, there'll be another obstacle, because this trauma is really deep, and the emotions are very complex. But yes, it felt, you know, it felt extraordinary in terms of our family coming together, and it's become a really important part of our family story, you know. But it wasn't all good. So part of my research, I asked my father about some, you know, did he know about some family members? What happened to family members? And he said, oh, you know, as often is the case with people who are in their 80s, he'd spent quite a lot of time making family trees. He was doing his genealogy. And he sent me a scan of this family trees. It was 6 A4s taped together with sellotape. And, you know, this huge document. There was scores of people on there, and I looked at it, and I called them back. I said, Dad, there's something missing. There's 5 of the names have no date of death. They've got date of birth but no date of death. And he said, oh, I don't know. He said, I couldn't find the information. They probably went to Argentina, or some of my family went to the States. I said, okay. I said, and I should explain that our family story had always been that we were the lucky ones. None of us, we'd lost nobody in the war. None of the Holocaust, we didn't have any victims of the Holocaust. And so and that'd be very much part of the story handed down by my grandparents. But then I went on to this database put together by Yad Vashem of the victims of the Holocaust, and within 5 minutes I found the names of these people, and they had been murdered in Germany, in Poland, and it was devastating. And so I had to share that with the family, and that had a real consequence, because we've had these family members who've been killed, which is awful and terrible, and in addition, it challenged this family story. And so, it has been a difficult journey at times. It's been full of some incredible high moments, like when we opened the house and the cleanup days and forging these new relationships in Germany, but also there have been some very hard moments as well.
I have another question by Andrew Gilchrist, asking whether there are other houses by the lake close by waiting for similar attention.
Well, that's a good question. There are other houses. There's actually some in Gross-Glienicke. 25% of Gross-Glienicke was Jewish before the Second World War. And some of those houses are abandoned and in desperate need of renovation. What actually happened, though, after the fall of the wall, there was a resurgence of claims by former Jewish families for their properties. And if they didn't make those claims, then an organization called the Jewish Claims Conference made the claims. And so most of those have been worked out. Most of those claims have been worked out. And for the most part, families have decided to sell their properties if they've had them back. So probably not many houses are likely to be renovated. There are a few. There are some beautiful, in Potsdam, if you've been to Potsdam, there's some beautiful palazios and villas have been renovated.
So Andrew, a real opportunity for you.
Villa, for example, was extraordinary. Sorry, Nick, what was that?
No, sorry, I spoke of you. I was saying, for Andrew, it's a real opportunity to come back to Potsdam and start to do some renovation.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And the city of Potsdam is really invested in conservation in an extraordinary way.
I have a question here by Michael and Dorothea Hollmann, asking which have been the wounds of the past inflicted in the house and the family that have been the most difficult to heal?
I spoke earlier, I think, about, I think the loss of the family members has been obviously very hard. I think different family members have different experiences. And for me, I think, the being dislocated from my German culture has been very odd. I'm in no ways would I feel German. I can't speak German. I didn't grow up in Germany. When I was growing up, we didn't go to Germany. We didn't buy German cars or washing machines. And yet I do feel German, and I feel very at home in Germany. And this process has been incredibly rewarding because of that. And, when I was younger and I'd go to Germany, I would see some older people and I'd wonder what they were doing during the war. And that was very much a fear. And I don't have that anymore. It's partly a passage of time, I think. But also spending time with my friends in Germany. So much so that about 4 or 5 years ago, I applied for the restitution of my German citizenship. And that was a very moving and positive experience. And the German embassy in London were remarkable. They treated our family as individuals. It was in no way was it seen as a kind of a conveyor belt. They were very individualistic. They were clearly deeply moved by our story, and they treated us with incredible sensitivity. And it was, it was a profoundly important moment for us and for me.
We have unfortunately not much time left, but there's one more question here asking about the funding of the project initially. This is a question by Claudia Hamill.
Blood, sweat and tears.
Claudia.
Blood, sweat and tears, right, Thomas?
What's that?
Blood, sweat and tears, I think.
Blood, sweat and tears.
The answer to that question.
Yeah. So we're always looking for contributions, to be honest. It's not easy. It's a very compelling story and it's very moving, but we're reliant on donors to support us. We're still looking for the final amount of money to renovate the house. We're almost there. And the next stage is going to be working on the garden, which hasn't been touched effectively for 60 years. And it used to be a beautiful garden. We need to organize the paths and the gates and the fencing and make it safe and the signage. But then also we'd like to go and work on the historical side. We've got pictures of the garden as it was in the 1920s, this lovely terraced area going down to the lake, the bushes, the trees, the flowers. So that's very much part of.
But in response to the question, the money was 40%, I'd say, roughly funded by state and federal government funds. It's very different from here, we learnt.
German,
and 60% by private donations, mostly from private individuals, trusts and foundations, largely from the UK, not entirely, but largely from
Holland,
from the UK and from the Netherlands. But it was a big effort, and as Thomas described, on a price per square foot, you would not want to be building this house.
I mean, we can say, I think we raised about 600,000 euros. I mean, a large amount of money. And I think we are still looking for around 2025 to complete the renovation of the house. So we're very close. We're very close to the end.
Well, thank you so much. That is unfortunately the end of our time. But thank you so much to Thomas and Nick for joining us this evening and for so generously sharing your time and expertise with us. And also thank you to everyone in the audience for dialing in. It was a real pleasure to host this discussion. And I would very much encourage you to read the book if you haven't already, members of the audience. So the BGA has some more events coming up in December. The LSE German Society has kindly offered BGA members the opportunity to attend 2 of their events. One is with Bodo Ramelau and Christian Lindner, and another with Tom Tugendhat and David McAllister. Plus, the BGA is holding its very own Christmas quiz soon, so do stay tuned for more information in the next few days. So on that note, thank you very much again for sharing your time with us tonight.
Thanks so much for having us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.